We are getting ready to get going here. If we'll just hold just one moment and we will begin our introductions. So I want to make sure we're up and running everywhere on Facebook Live and on Zoom and the various platforms. Okay, it looks like we are up and running. This is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. I'm so thrilled to have you here with us for our ongoing virtual author event series, which we have been doing for the past year, 12, 14, 15 months or so. We've done well over 160 of these virtual talks in that time and have had so many different authors and different conversations. And it's been a really great way, I say this often, but a great way to stay connected with all of you in this weird, strange year that we've had. But really thrilled to say we're going to be returning in some form or fashion to some in-person events next month, toward the end of next month, and kind of easing our way slowly back into some of those spaces. So you can go to our website, magiccitybooks.com, and you can see the full schedule for that. And, I'm hoping by the time we get to the fall, we'll be at more of a 50-50 scenario and then kind of move forward from there. Couldn't be more thrilled with today's event. We've had the great pleasure over the last few years to partner many times with our friends at the Bob Dylan Center and do many Bob Dylan adjacent events. And our bookstore, for those who may not know, or if you're watching, we're right here in the Arts District of downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. So we're about 2 blocks away from the historic Greenwood district, where, if you know, the centennial recently of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. So that just kind of puts you in a little bit of context as to where we are. But on the other side of our building, we will be literally just down the street from the future physical space of the Bob Dylan Center, which will be opening next year. And so really excited about having that proximity. And, that's going to be such a national, international draw. We hope to maybe see some of you guys. If you're watching from afar, you'll make the trip to Tulsa and come see us while you're here. So I have never had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Clinton Heylin, although I know he has been to the bookstore many times on his weeks and weeks visiting the archives and coming to Tulsa. We just never quite were able to connect, but I was always hearing about him being in town and working in the archive and working on this project. And today I'm really excited too, because I get to sit back and listen and watch. I don't have to be the moderator. I do so many of these, but I'm always thrilled when I can bring in a pal to handle the moderating for me. And handling our moderation today is going to be Mark Davidson. Mark is the head of head archivist and librarian for the Bob Dylan Archives. Has been here in Tulsa working in that huge trove of treasures for many years now, and worked side by side with Clinton on his trips here to Tulsa. This book, as you'll hear, is kind of the first book to come out of working directly in those archives. And the book is The Double Life of Bob Dylan, a Restless, Hungry Feeling, 1941 to 1966. A great little reference there to one of my favorite Dylan songs, One Too Many Mornings, which is on The Times They Are a Changin', which is a great little tune. And so Clinton is going to be in conversation with Mark. Most importantly, we want you guys to ask questions too. So drop those into the Q&A and we'll pull some of those as we go along. And you need this book. This is the beginning of a journey. We won't get into how many volumes there will be, but this is the starting point for this. And I think no one is more authoritative in the world really on Bob Dylan than Clinton. I think he is well regarded as the expert. So you're going to be hearing it directly from the source. You can buy a copy of The Double Life of Bob Dylan directly in the chat here. We'll put some links there, and we'll keep posting those throughout the talk. So we'll make it easy for you to do that. If you know someone in your life who loves Dylan, this is just a great gift for that person, and a wonderful book club book too, to talk about this person who kind of still exists and roams among us humans, but seems somehow legendary and mythical at the same time. So thank you, Clinton, for doing this and joining us all the way from the UK virtually. And thank you, Mark. I will hand it over to you to take it from here.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Really excited to do this. Happy to have Clinton at a comfortable distance. And I'm Dr. Mark Davidson. I'm the archives director of the American Song Archives, which encompasses both the Bob Dylan and Woody Guthrie archives, as well as Tom Paxton, Phil Oakes, and the other collections that we have here in Tulsa. I'll just say we've been working really hard over the pandemic on the forthcoming Bob Dylan Center, which will open May 10th. And if you go to bobdylancenter.com, you'll get some more information about it there, and you can sign up for founding memberships and stay up to date there. Get on our mailing list and get all the great information. Yeah, as Jeff mentioned, Clinton and I think this will make this interview unique, is that we've spent every waking working hour over 10 weeks and many evenings and weekends spending time together, me fumbling around trying to find the materials that you need, and otherwise just kind of taking in Tulsa together. So I'm excited to talk to you about the book, sort of how you came to writing this particular volume, and a number of other things. So, Clinton, you've written a couple dozen books at this point, ranging, depending on how you count it, about 10 on Bob Dylan, with the various versions of your biography, Behind the Shades, which is now this current volume, The Double Life of Bob Dylan, totally revised. You've also written about Fairport Convention, Sandy Denny, Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band, Orson Welles, the foundations of American punk rock, mental illness and British rock music of the 60s, English and Scottish ballad traditions, copyright infringement, bootlegs. Are there any rocks that you haven't turned over at this point? And how do these subjects all work together for you?
That's a good question, Mark. I mean, the answer is I don't think in terms of, oh, this has to fit with the last one or the next one or whatever. I mean, obviously, I wrote the original Behind the Shades in 1991, so that was 30 years ago. So people obviously know me more as a music historian than anything else, and most of my 28 books are music books in some form or other. But as you know from our many chats, my tastes are certainly eclectic, like yours. And yeah, everything from 16th century Scottish ballads to Suicide, the New York punk band, not the act of. I'm always kind of drawn back to Bob, and each time that I try and get him out of my system, I fail. So this time I decided the only way to do it was to do a multi-volume solution to getting it out of my system. So we'll see whether that works. But
I think so far so good. I was tremendously excited to see what you were able to make out of the archival materials. Exciting for me to see a work that is so densely packed with all the information that we have to glean. I did want to touch on. So your first book was on Public Image Limited, I believe. But your next book was on the gospel speeches of Bob Dylan, or your first Bob Dylan book.
Well, I did. I mean, the thing is that to be strictly correct, I did several self-published things on Dylan throughout the 80s. The thing is, because obviously I was a co-founder of Wanted Man, the Bob Dylan information office that ran the Telegraph, and I contributed, I think, more articles than anybody else in that decade to the Telegraph. At the same time, because we had this thing called the Bookshelf, which sold obscure and difficult to find Dylan periodicals and books and monographs and ... So I had my own kind of access to anything, in terms of the readership for the Telegraph, to do my own crazy little things. So I did do my very first book back in 1982 was a rumorography. So I wrote a 130-page book of Bob Dylan rumors. When I say a rumorography, I mean a rumorography like a discography. I mean, literally, do these recordings exist? I mean, not tittle tattle, not, a rumor of a recording. And so, and what is amazing when you go back to that book is how many of them we now have. I mean, because it was every crazy rumor. I mean, some of which came from good, reliable sources, but many of which came from completely barking mad Dylanologists. But funnily enough, some of those subsequently turned up. So, I mean, many of them, let me say, I don't think I'm hopefully not talking out of shop, but one of my Holy Grail tapes that's in that rumorography that I had no expectation would ever turn up is the Berkeley Community Theatre, February the 22nd, 1964, which I believe you're on the trail of. So just how weird that should, after all these years, one of those legendary shows. So, the Public Image book was the first properly published by a real publisher book. But there'd been all sorts of weird and obscure things that I self-published on my dad's Xerox machine before that.
Well, you get at a point that that I wanted to explore with you, which is the barking mad Dylanologist point. I guess your first Dylan album was the bootleg Talking Bear Massacre Picnic Blues.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah.
But that's a bootleg. How did you come across that, and what did that do for you?
Well, of course, it wasn't meant to be my first Dylan record, just as my first single wasn't supposed to be by Marmalade, but the one that I wanted to buy had sold out. The same thing with the Dylan. I went into this bootleg shop, which I knew about in Manchester, looking for the Royal Albert Hall, 1966. So that's what I wanted. I mean, I'd read this article in Let It Rock by a guy called Tony White about Bob Dylan bootlegs. And of course, he was effusively praising this legendary concert from the Royal Albert Hall, which of course was not from the Royal Albert Hall. But and it turned out Tony White was not Tony White. It turned out it was Michael Gray. But I didn't know any of that, being 12 years old. But I did go down. I asked around. I found out there was a bootleg shop. They sold mostly German pornography, but did sell bootleg albums. And went down there, and they didn't have it. They sold that, and they said, "We'll have some more." And so I started leafing through the bins and found this album. And I'd read the lyrics. Somehow I'd read the lyrics to Talking Bear Mountain, and I just thought it was hilarious. I loved the song, and so I bought the album. And I took it home, and it sounded great. I mean, it's studio outtakes that are freewheeling, so there wasn't any problem with the sound quality. And to me, there was never any real distinction between official and unofficial. And obviously, 50 years later, there still isn't any distinction in my mind. It's all part of one big smorgasbord.
Yeah, so in England in the 1970s. You've spoken a bit about, and I want to discuss this a little bit about what Dylan meant to the British music press at the time, and where you and your colleagues who were writing about Dylan in England, where you saw a void, maybe.
Well, certainly. I mean, by 1980, when John Baldy, myself, Dave Dingle, John Lindley, and Bob Carroll set up Wanted Man, by that point, they weren't interested. I mean, the mainstream rock media were not writing about Bob Dylan because he become horrors of horrors, a Christian. And so, I mean, we still had a vibrant weekly music press then. I mean, we still had Sounds, we still had NME, and we still had Melody Maker, and we still had Record Mirror. So we had 4 weekly papers pouring out a diet of pop trivia. But Bob Dylan was beyond the pale. So we set up Wanted Man with that express intention of getting information out there, because there was no way of following that. And Ian Woodward had set up the Wicked Messenger newsletter but that was only available by sort of private subscription. So we made it available to everyone who subscribed to Wanted Man. So that was really the point of Wanted Man originally, was to distribute Ian's newsletter.
Yeah, I think that's one of the fascinating things about Dylan is that he's had over the decades a really sustained, really passionate fan base of people writing about him, about obsessing about him, of course. But all of that is, we have the Dylan's personal, working archive between 1964 and 2012 here in Tulsa. But so many of those materials that you all generated and others have as well around the world are also part of this larger history of Bob Dylan. And that's a really important point. And certainly we in Tulsa would like to be the magnet for that. Now,
yeah, I mean, there's certainly, the two defining moments in serious Dylan scholarship, prior, obviously, to the archive, are 1969, when the three major collectors put together a proper Dylan tape archive: A.J. Webman, Simon Montgomery, and Sandy Gant. Simon's still with us. A.J. is with the fairies. Sandy's no longer with us. But hugely important. And they chased down source tapes. They tracked every trail. And without them, there wouldn't be the extraordinary archive, particularly of early Dylan recordings that do exist. And the founding of Wanted Man in 80-81, certainly, because it became a center for Dylan scholarship, from gentlemen scholars, if I may use that term. We were still well outside academia. Dylan doesn't really get accepted in academia till well into the 21st century, and that's still an ongoing process,
Yeah. So, and you were trained as a historian. You bristle a bit at when people call you a music journalist or a rock critic, or where's the separation there for you?
Well, I've never been a journalist. It's not even, I don't even know where the discussion comes up from. I never did journalism. It's not something I ever did. Occasionally I've been commissioned to write a piece, but usually it's to promote something that I've written. I don't, and never have. Of course, I grew up reading the greatest rock journalism of all time, which was the British music press of the mid-70s. The truly extraordinary body of writers who were writing that material. It was as important to people my age who were living with that music as the people who grew up in the 50s reading the Beats and listening to jazz. It really was that important. So that certainly colored my entire outlook as a writer, and certainly as a critic. I certainly don't balk at being called a critic. It'd be hard for me to refute that. But I always say, I'm an historian by training, and I hope that comes out in the books.
Yeah, I'm hoping to shift to your current volume, and I want to know about the first time that you saw what became the Tulsa Archive and sort of realized, oh no, I have to go back and do this again.
The real starting point was actually in New York, because I'd been asked to do some work on what became the Showtime documentary on the basement tapes that was made to tie in with the Lost on the River album set. And so I'd gone up to the Dylan office, and I asked to look at the material that Lost on the River was created from, and that obviously formed also part of that documentary. Those folders of Dylan lyrics and jottings and whatever from post-accident. Obviously some dispute about how post-accident, but certainly post-accident. And so that was really the first clue that there was a lot of new material we really didn't know about that would suddenly be coming available, was being found in boxes somewhere. And then obviously the story broke in the New York Times about the acquisition of the archive. And as you know, the first time that I came to Tulsa was to do a conference that Sean Latham had very kindly invited me to, and so I got my first look at what there was. And obviously, as you know, the first thing I looked at was the Blood and the Tracks notebooks, and I mean, as soon as you realise, to me, I wrote a book about the bootlegging of William Shakespeare's sonnets, and to me that was like looking at the manuscripts of the sonnets. It really was like that, and gee, I wish I could, but I mean, that was a pretty good second choice,
So I want to know what was maybe the most significant thing you found, the most significant revision to your previous biographical efforts on Dylan. Like, what was the thing that you found in the archive that you said, oh, I got that wrong, and this is an incredible revelation about what we thought we knew about Bob Dylan?
Well, contrary to what many people seem to think, I got many things wrong, and I'm not ashamed to say that. And I don't know why people think that I have a problem admitting that I get things wrong. I get things wrong all the time. That's why I keep rewriting the damn books. I said, I think in my Dylan Day by Day, the very first original edition in '87 of Stolen Moments, I said, Dylan is a moving target, and I meant it. And not only are we dealing with a living artist, but we're also dealing with a mercurial artist who shapeshifts all the time. As anyone who has seen any part of the new book, essentially the book is a deconstruction of the myth that Dylan himself is fastidiously creating around himself in the 21st century. He is setting out to create a mythical version of himself that there is 40 years of material to disprove, all of which came from him. So that it's not just that I'm wrong in inverted commas about things. It's actually that I'm constantly having to re-revise, because Dylan himself is coming out and saying, I never met Elvis. Yes, you did. No, I didn't. Yes, you did. Went to see the Gypsy is about you meeting Elvis. And you said so at the time. If I have to believe the 1970 Bob Dylan or the 2020 Bob Dylan, I know which one I'll believe. The real revelation, and I think we talked about this, the real revelation about the archive is not this particular detail, that particular detail. It's the fact that it exists. Because, Jesus, Bob Dylan, a fastidious keeper of his papers? Who would have thought? It is truly extraordinary. I think I make the analogy in the introduction to the new book with the Hitler diaries, because that's exactly what it felt like. I mean, the Hitler diaries were fake, but what was extraordinary when that story broke was that people had to believe that Hitler kept 52 volumes of diaries whilst plotting the destruction of the world. Oh, and I've got time to keep 52 diaries. And it's the same with Dylan. It isn't truly extraordinary that, that he kept this stuff, and the sheer scale. We talked about this, that, the idea that not just that there is a draft version of Joker Man, a great song from 1983, but that there are 17 draft versions of Joker Man. That's the extraordinary thing. I mean, the thing that you realize the discipline that has gone into what he's created. And also, which I'd already suspected just from looking at the Morgan Library, the Tracks notebook and the Another Side manuscripts and various other things. But the one thing that's fascinating about Dylan is that he almost never makes a wrong call as a rewriter of his work. And yet he almost never makes a right call when he's in the studio and he decides to change something. So there's a really interesting contradiction there.
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I do think that the archive that we have really shows how dedicated and diligent a worker he was at various points throughout his career, like really working at his craft. And it's something that we're, one of the main goals of the upcoming Bob Dylan Center is to give people a sense of that in a tangible way. I'm curious, you mentioned the Morgan Library, and it's not just the Tulsa archive that you've been through. You have scoured, pretty much any manuscript that has been out there, looking for authenticity and at times authenticating these manuscripts yourself. How many, tons of interviews. Talk a little bit about your research process for this book and the sort of scope of it over the last, let's say, 35 years or so.
Well, I mean, one of the fascinating things about doing the new book is that the approach to it is completely different from Behind the Shades, and the reason the approach is different is not really just the extraordinary resource, the archive, but the fact that we can no longer trust what we're being told, because people's memories are shot. People have told the same story 42 times, and I keep reading things and I keep going. I read something the other day. This is absolutely true. I was reading Sid Griffin's book on the Rolling Thunder Tour. It's not very good, I'm afraid, but he interviews a guy from Sony who was the assistant engineer on Desire. And he tells a story in his unpublished memoir, and I can see why it's unpublished, that he was instructed to go and erase the original version of Hurricane because of the lyrical issues with it. Now, it is, of course, complete nonsense, but he tells this incredibly elaborate story about where these tapes are kept in a cage and he has to erase the vocal tracks. And, and I'm going, that's kind of weird, because in 1996, I looked at all those tape boxes and they were all immaculately intact. And you're sort of going, how can you be telling this story? I mean, it's such nonsense. Yeah. And we're talking a book published in the 21st century. And we have to shoot that kind of stuff down while we still can, So a lot of the work that one does is actually going, no, that didn't happen. And now, obviously, if a story gets hold of the wider discourse, it becomes particularly important to dismantle that story, and of course, if it's by Bob Dylan that the misinformation comes, it's even more problematic. And yeah, of course, you always come up against that. How do you know Bob Dylan was there, you weren't, and I tell the story in the introduction to the new book about the Robert Johnson. I use this as an example where I'm going, well, he tells the story in Chronicles about John Hammond gives him an acetate of King of the Delta Blues Singers. And why would you tell a lie about that? Why? Why wouldn't you just say John Hammond gave me a copy of the album? But he's very particular. He describes an acetate, and he's going, and I heard Robert Johnson for the first time and it blew my mind. And I'm going, okay. So fortunately, I have the database, the official, the Sony archive database of their release dates for all their albums, every album they ever put out. And sure enough, I look up the King of the Delta Blues Singers, and it's 6 weeks before Bob Dylan signed his contract. Now, there's no way that John Hammond is keeping an acetate of that album 6 weeks after it came out. It goes in the bin, he gives them an album. And I don't think he did that either, because you can trace the influence of Robert Johnson. Listen to the music. You know, we have the Minneapolis Hotel tape, 26 songs on the Minneapolis Hotel tape, enormous amount of blues material on that tape. And that's from December the 22nd, 1961. Not one note of it sounds like Robert Johnson. He hasn't heard it. He hasn't heard it. By February the 7th, 1962, so 6 weeks later, he's talking to Izzy Young, who mentions it in his diary, that he's writing a song called The Death of Robert Johnson. He's heard Robert Johnson. So we can say some point. Now, I believe that he probably did get that album from John Hammond, but he didn't get it when he signed, and he didn't get it when he made the album. He got it at some later point. You have to ask questions like that because it tells a lot. We have to know when he heard Robert Johnson. We have to know what influence it had and how immediate was that influence. We have to know that information.
Yeah, these are the sorts of conversations I always enjoyed getting into with you while you were in the archive, which is, you know, we know where he was on, you know, December 22nd, and you know, and it brings up a couple of things, and I'll hold off on the Chronicles piece for now, but it brings up the importance of archival materials and whether or not we can trust them as evidence, whether or not we can look at a notebook and assume that on page 12 when he wrote such and such that it happened, you know, he didn't just open the notebook to that page and therefore sort of throwing chaos into the chronology. But were there instances in the materials that you looked at in the archive where that in itself, you know, sort of created some confusion around the evidence you thought you had?
Oh, of course. I mean, the thing is, obviously, this first volume, the material that I'm using from the archive is mostly not the manuscript material. You know, it's the audio and the visual material. Obviously, a fantastic archive of Don't Look Back outtakes, Eat the Document outtakes, the Tony Glover material, some of the early contracts, things like that are all in the archive and are all a fantastic resource, but we're not pulling up the manuscript, except for the Tarantula material, you know, but certainly we've had this discussion. I mean, the first Blood on the Tracks notebook, where the first 5 pages appear to be very, very early, December 73, January 74. But, like, you know, 3 pages later, he's drawing up a book list of books that were published in October 1974. Indisputably were published in October 1974. So can't possibly be from January 74. So, I mean, of course, all of those challenges lie before us. You know, we're all going to have to work with the material. You and I have had some very interesting discussions about the dating of the Lost on the River material, and it's still, I think, a contentious issue. And whether we'll nail it down or not, we'll have to wait and see. But you know, it's like I said, the guy's a moving target. You know.
Yeah. We've been dancing around, or we've essentially Chronicles has come up a number of times in this conversation, and I got a question in the Q&A about Dylan sort of creating this myth around himself, particularly in Chronicles, and you know, there have been other Dylanologists who have pretty much gone line by line and word by word, finding where he might have, you know, borrowed sentences from other authors and the like. Is there anything you can glean out of Chronicles aside from a good sort of generalized story about Dylan's life?
Well, I mean, I use the example elsewhere where I talk about Dylan tells the lie to Robert Shelton in '66, which of course Bob Shelton believes. that Dylan was a rent boy in New York when he first came there, and he places himself in New York a couple of months before he actually got there. And I mean, it's a ludicrous story. And the fact that Shelton believed it in 1986 is bizarre. I mean, believe it in 1961 when you might not know, but I mean, there's just so much evidence. We know where Bob was at all, you know, again, almost to the day. And now that the archive has the magnificent tape from Madison, we really do know where it is, where he is. But what I've always said about that particular revelation is what it tells us about Dylan in 1966, because he's telling us that he's living the Rambodian fantasy, that he is the Arthur Rimbaud of the village scene. And so he glones himself onto the Arthur Rimbaud myth, that he came to Paris to be a rent boy, you know, that idea. So it tells us a lot about Dylan. It just doesn't tell us anything about what he claims he's telling us. And Chronicles is the same. Chronicles tells us an enormous amount about Dylan's psyche in the early part of the 21st century. It tells us almost nothing about his psyche in 1961.
Yeah, it's interesting because we were discussing those manuscripts before we hopped on here, and one of the pages I found was around the Camilla Adams story.
Right.
The woman who hosted a party in the book with Sis Cunningham and, you know, a cast of, you know, Greenwich Village's most important, you know,
well, and I say in the introduction, I mean, you know, that party was either the greatest party in the history of the world, you know, if you look at the guest list that Dylan constructs, or it never happened, you know.
Yeah, and so, you know, I went down the rabbit hole of trying to find out who Camilla Adams was, and
asking me.
Well, two things came out of that. One is I thought he's referring to Cynthia Gooding here, and his portrayal is a pseudonym for Cynthia Gooding, whose archive we have here in Tulsa as well. Until I found the 1966 broadside, volume 71, where Camilla Adams had written an article on Woody Guthrie, and then I thought, well, is this a pseudonym? And did this person exist? So what I'm getting at is there's so many grains of salt to take this with, but there are so many places that, as you know, an archivist or a historian, you know, there are 1,000 rabbit holes within every rabbit hole, and it's so difficult to, you know, make these, you know, that's part of the acrobatics that I think you do very well, which is, you know, try to nail yeah.
You know, the thing is, like, in your Chronicles material, the few things that I might have seen, I mean, he gets the name Jeannie Robertson, a truly fabulous ballad singer, as I'm sure you'd agree, from Scotland, who Dylan would have known the works of. He spells her name perfectly correctly in the manuscript. In the book, it's Jeannie Robinson. I mean, there's no way that a copy editor, unless he had the same copy editor I had, would have changed the spelling on a completely random basis to make me look stupid. I mean, you know, I mean, so who changed the spelling? I mean, is this Dylan having a joke at our expense? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't know the answer. I'm just saying it's one of those great mysteries, because I couldn't believe when I read Chronicles originally that Dylan would get the name wrong of somebody he, you know, held up absolutely as one of his favorite ballad singers.
Yes.
Rightly.
Yeah, and it does show the depth and the web of connections that Bob Dylan had. You've mentioned before, and you talked about it a bit when you talked about Wanted Man, about the importance of milieu in writing about, you know, historical figures, about having lived in the time period and being able to talk to the people at the time that, they're having, rather than,
Absolutely.
what Bob says in the Rolling Thunder, it was 40 years ago. I don't remember any of this.
And we don't know if he's telling the truth. I mean, the interesting thing about that, obviously, is in the Scorsese movie, and it's the funniest line in the movie. I don't remember a damn thing. It's of course he then, presents a completely mythical, never happened tour anyway. So who knows? But it's a great line. But the problem is that we don't know that. I remember Joan Baez said at one point, she said, well, talking about Dylan's memory, she said, well, yeah, there are things that he's completely blank on. And there are other things where he remembers unbelievable detail from 40 years ago and will nail you on it. And there's elements of both in his personality. So you've got to be incredibly wary of thinking that it's just that he doesn't remember. That's a convenience of thought that Dylan wants us to buy into. And as I talk about in the book, one of the things about interviewing people now is very occasionally I find somebody that's not been interviewed, and that there's a million questions one needs to ask, and their memory is good. And because they haven't been asked these questions repeatedly, they remember details. And they're a gold mine. There's not many of them, but I'm on the trail of one at the moment, a very important one. And I hope she comes through, because she's somebody that crops up so many times in the Tulsa archive, and nobody has ever interviewed her on Dylan, and she's still around. But 8 times out of 10, when you're interviewing someone about things that happened 40 years ago, you either the memory is not there, or what they remember is just not reliable. And doesn't mean they're a bad person. It doesn't mean they weren't there. I mean, I quote in the introduction about Glenn Berger, who was the assistant engineer on Blown the Tracks, and lovely guy, very helpful, has real insights into the process of that particular album. But every single factual statement that he's made in print about Blown the Tracks is wrong. It just is, and we have the tapes, we know.
Yeah. So I want to ask about the forthcoming volume, but I also know that you come out of a particular sort of lineage of historians and writers about music, and Bob Dylan in particular. There has been some criticism about your opinions on other Dylan biographers, and it brouhahas in the press and on Twitter. I think it's important that you are able to sort of correct some of these, the record in the way that you are.
There's nothing remotely personal about my comments about other writers. And as I said earlier, I get things wrong all the time. If people take umbrage at me pointing out that they got it wrong, they shouldn't have written something in the first place, because as a writer, you will be attacked. It isn't about that. I'm a myth buster. The person who gets it in the neck most often by me is Bob Dylan. And he's the greatest popular genius of the 20th century. So you should be flattered if I decide to give you a kicking too, because it's not personal. I don't, whether you're kind to dogs or whatever, that's not the issue. The issue is you've made a statement, you've made it in print, it's potentially destructive of the truth, and it leads us down the wrong path. And it is not because, as a friend of mine said, it's not because I'm bad-mannered that I pointed out.
No.
And it's ironic that the hoo-ha in this particular volume was created by the worst Dylan biographer of them all, Howard Seams, who created publicity so that people became aware of the fact that I don't think of him, much of him, as a writer, as an historian, as a researcher. I mean, who brings that to the attention of millions of people? and which he did, and then wrote a letter to my editor saying that I'd libeled him. So I libeled him to 5,000 people, and he went and told 500,000 people. He went and told 500,000 people, and well, which is it? You know, it's generally, if you have been actually libeled, you wouldn't then make a point of telling everyone. You know, it's not about that. It's about and if Mr. Soons thinks that I laid in wait for him in volume 1, boy, wait till you get to volume 2 when he really is at sea. Because the Bob Dylan narrative up to the accident is easy. Even if you know nothing, like Howard, you can still write that story because everybody knows that narrative up to the accident. Once you get past the accident, the life story becomes very challenging. Just sorting the facts from the fiction, following the work, you really need to know your stuff. And of course, he doesn't.
Yeah. So that brings up a couple of important points. I know, you know, I come out of academia, and I'm no stranger to those sorts of attacks. It's sort of par for the course. It's sometimes humbling. It's sometimes, you know, revelatory, or you know, makes you really double down on what you know. But I'm thinking about, as an archivist, fact from fiction, and the problem of forgeries in Bob Dylan's, you know,
Whoa,
yeah.
accept that.
It's how in that case have you navigated the true from the false, and what potential harm for sort of, you know, writing history does that present?
Well, I mean, I must donate a copy to the archive of my original masterpiece, my rumorography, because it goes all the way back. You know that book that I wrote, Rain Unraveled Tales, in 1982, has entire sets of lyrics that are supposedly by Dylan that are not. I mean, there's wonderful fake Dylan albums in there, fake sessions, fake. I mean, so it goes way back. You know, for some reason, something in Dylan's iconography sets people off and leads them down deliberately falsifying trails. And we'll try and steer clear of naming names, but you know, there have been many, and there still are. And I have discussions with the people at Sotheby's and with other auction houses all the time, because they'll present something to me and I'll go, no, no, you know, you know, there's serious landmines there. And, you know, there's a few things that I talk about in the first volume, some of the manuscripts that have turned up that there are serious question marks about. But obviously that's going to become much murkier once we get past 66. Yeah. You know, and yeah, it's and it's something we have to get nailed down now, you know, while people are still alive, while we can still question stuff. I mean, some of the stuff that's turned up that's been attributed to Kevin Crown, who was Dylan's friend and early manager, and Kevin did have Dylan manuscripts, which of course really muddies the water. But the question of what is genuine that purports to be from Kevin Crown is a huge issue, because Kevin died in the early 70s, I believe. Certainly Scaduto is the only person who ever interviewed him. And so we can't get back there. You know, we have to use other evidence. But yeah, I mean, we won't get things wrong. There's no question. And Bob doesn't help us. And there's no reason why I should, you know, but you know, he's certainly led a few false trails himself, you know.
Yeah, all great points. You know, even if I had the proverbial, you know, Bob phone that I could pick up and ask him about certain manuscripts, I you know, couldn't trust that.
Well, yeah, the answer wouldn't be trusted. I mean, it's like people who ask me all the time about, you know, you've never met Bob Dylan, don't you want to meet him? I'm like, what would be the point? He's not going to tell me the truth. And it shouldn't. There's absolutely no reason Bob Dylan should tell me the truth. I'm the last person he should be telling the truth to. And if he did tell me the truth, I would then follow it up with a question that was even more intrusive. So, you can't go down that route, and I have no expectation that I would. So it's not his job to make it easy for us, And the challenge, part of the beauty of Dylan, is that his world is his world. He creates a world for us, and why do we think it has to be the real world, whatever that is? It isn't. No artist does. Some artists live in an unreal world because they have serious issues, psychological issues. I don't think that's Bob, but others just choose to live in a world of their own creation. Most great writers, actually.
So I want to ask about the next volume, but I did have a question that I don't want to miss that came through about, do you have any advice for somebody who's getting started, a young aspiring music historian or biographer, like how would one get started, especially if they were writing about Bob and didn't have the luxury of having lived through, the first, large chunk of his creative life?
Well, I mean, I think the great thing for anybody coming to a subject, and Dylan is a huge challenge now, and the archive makes it worse, of course, because of the sheer scale of it, in terms of how much to assimilate and how much material, just basic factual material, you have to carry with you in order to enter the portal. But I think with any, when you're dealing with history and art, which is what we're talking about, with any artist, I think essentially you narrow it down. So some of the best work that's been done on Dylan, actually, I think I go further and say most of the best work that's been done on Dylan has been forensic, by which I mean it takes a small aspect of the life, of the career, of the work, and nails it, and certainly, some of the younger people that I've met in Tulsa who are passionate about Dylan and are interested in the archive from that point of view. I mean, I said that to a couple of them. Essentially, pick what you want to write about and just don't try and do it all. It's like a Shakespeare scholar. You could spend your life working on Hamlet. You don't, and never go further. And you could do the same with Dylan. And that's the only real advice that I could give. And also, again, we've talked about this. I think one of the biggest problems, and it's not just with Dylan, it's in general, with a lot of collector stroke obsessives. And I make my little joke in the introduction about how Dylan scholars are called Dylan obsessors, but Shakespeare scholars are called Shakespeare scholars. I mean, I'd love to know what the distinction is, but one of the problems with any major artist is that if you create him or her as the totality, you're missing so much. I mean, the one thing that I've learned in the last 30, 40 years as working on this stuff is that the greatest thing that I can bring to bear is my knowledge of the milieu, of everything that he lived in. And fortunately, my passion, as you well know, my passion for traditional ballads and traditional folk songs is paramount anyway to me. And therefore, I'm able to feel, I think, a lot of what Dylan felt in 1961 in terms of what it is that's there that can't be found anywhere else. But I think if you're going to get into this stuff, then you need to widen your scope to include all the things that are out there that make sense of who that person is and why they became what they are. And as you know, the other great singer-songwriter of the same era, British, Richard Thompson, exactly the same would apply. To try and understand Richard Thompson without understanding the traditional milieu and the traditional background is impossible.
Yeah, and you have written quite a bit on Richard Thompson and Fairport, Now, just talking about how difficult it would be to write a good single volume biography of Bob Dylan because so much would get missed. We've got volume 1 of your book now, and it covers 25 years of his life. So by extension, I would expect that there would be at least 2 more volumes. What should we expect? When should we expect it? Don't say you need to come back to Tulsa.
Well, you know that I need to come back to Tulsa, but I mean, the answer is, unfortunately, I can't answer the question because I don't know, because at the moment we're still in this kind of limbo, largely because of the COVID situation, that I have said to both the English and the American publisher, realistically, the book should be 3 volumes, but obviously I was contracted to do 2. If they want a 300,000 word second volume, that may be what the book becomes. That may be what the second volume is. I think 3 volumes will be better, but you know, all I can say is watch this space. I don't know. I mean, I genuinely don't know. I'm not thinking about it. I'm just writing it, you know, and I've already written the section up to Blood on the Tracks is already done, and the period up to the end of 81 will be done by the end of the year. So, you know, we're well along. I mean, the next volume should be out on what is supposed to be my next delivery date, whether it's 2 of 3 or 2 of 2, I don't know, but hopefully May 2023. You were saying obviously about the center opens May 2022. So, you know, so hopefully they won't have too long to wait, but there's no point in rushing it. There's no point in, you know, and thankfully, you know, I have other books I want to write, but this is paramount and this is what I'm going to do. And if it takes me another 3 years to do it, so be it. I mean, the good news is I'm not Robert Caro. I'm not going to turn it into 5 volumes writing about somebody who was sort of important in an unimportant way, and just endlessly stretch it out. Oh, and I'm quick. That was it. There was something else I forgot to mention. I mean, I don't get it. I don't understand people who spend 20 years working on a book, any book, and I'm including 7 Pillars of Wisdom.
Yeah, I get it. So if it were 3, volume 2 would go up to 81. Are you saying?
81. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. So, and that would be about the same size as the current volume. Okay. If it's 3 volumes, the next volume will be again 190,000 words, covering up to the end of the so-called gospel period. Yeah, and that's already conceptualized and ready to go, pretty much. And obviously, let me say, because I think it's important that we boost the archive, particularly given it's Magic City Books. I think it's very important to say that the archive really comes into its own in volume 2. You know, I mean, volume 1 might leave readers salivating for what's in the archive, but it's barely touching the surface, really, compared with what we're going to get to, which is peering in, and you know, I think I can say peering into Dylan's working methods in a way that has never been possible. Never.
Yeah, well, we're excited to have you back. I'm excited to see what comes out of the rest of the writings. As you say, our archive starts around 1964 in earnest, and your first book ends in 66. So the good stuff is yet to come, and we're getting towards the end of the hour here. I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us. Thank Jeff Martin and Magic City Books for having us again. The Bob Dylan Center will be opening May 10th, 2022. Hopefully we'll have Clinton out at that time to see all that we've been working on. And final question, where is your favorite place to get a breadstick in Tulsa?
A breadstick? Why a breadstick? Oh, yes, of course, my broken tooth.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sorry. Yeah, I was a bit slow on that, but I can tell you where my favorite place, obviously, to get my coffee is. Antoinette, absolutely. Yeah,
Yes.
although I like Magic City Books coffee as well, but yes, they don't have the Friday pie evening, which I hope you're still having, even
Oh,
though I'm not there.
as far as I know, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Antoinette's is still there and going strong, and I'm sure everybody there will be very excited to see you again when you're back in Tulsa.
When I finally get back, yeah, no, but I'd love to see everyone. It's I miss being in Tulsa. I miss seeing you guys, and yeah, I mean, and the archive is only part of it, but it's going to attract so many people, and and it's going to blow people's minds. I mean, when the center's finally up and running, I mean, so everything can run consecutively, that you can follow lines of reasoning and follow lines of thought. It's really going to be extraordinary. And,
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and you're doing a bang up job, Mark.
Well, thank you. We're doing the best we can, and
And one of these days I'll get to hear the knocked out loaded tapes.
yes.
That's a little private joke.
Yes, one of these days soon. Okay, well, thank you to everybody who's joined us. Again, thank you, Jeff and Magic City Books. We'll hopefully do this again at Volume 2 and then Volume 3 and 4, 5, and 6.
And maybe, who knows, in person, who knows?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. God willing, creeks don't rise. So
great to see you, Mark. Thank you, Magic City. Thank you really very much for promoting the book, and I hope to see you all very soon for a nice latte at Antoinette.
yes. Wonderful. Thank you.
Cheers, Mark. All the best.
Yes. Bye-bye.